Everyone. As we continue to read through Galatians today, we are right around Galatians chapter 3, verse 4 or 5 or 6. We're going to circle back and start back with chapter 3 because we were just talking about this before I started up the live stream, because everyone loves this passage, right? This is what we all woke up to in Galatians. We have the "Oh, stupid Galatians" line. And I felt a little bit, I was a little bit, felt like I missed out last week because Deacon was here, Deacon Larry, and he was able to take this passage for himself and said, no, we got to circle back and talk about it because it is really what we've been working up to, right? As we've been discussing the first couple of chapters, there's kind of been this building, whatever you want to call it, this building tension, maybe we could say, right, with St. Paul, where he's discussing about, just to kind of review what the general theme of this letter is, he's discussing this whole theme of these Judaizers, right, these people who have come in after he went in and preached the gospel to the Galatians and converted many to Christianity. These Judaizers come in and start telling people, no, Paul doesn't have it right. This gospel you have isn't right. You need to somehow add something more to what you're doing. In particular, they say adding the observation of the Mosaic law. So following the Jewish law to a T, including circumcision, including the dietary restrictions, right? They're saying you have to now add this on or else you're not a true Christian, right? And the tension is building and through this whole beginning of the letter because Paul, as we can tell, is angry about that, right? These other people have come in and tried to usurp his role as the apostle, the evangelizer of the Galatians. And so he's getting a little bit more worked up. And then, as we talked about, chapter 3, verse 1. Oh, stupid Galatians. There it is.
Excuse me, Father. Where
yes.
Does Galatians come after Thessalonians?
It comes right after, if you find where Corinthians is, First Corinthians and Second Corinthians, it's right after that. Yeah, it's short, so it kind of gets lost in the pages. Yeah, there you go. And then we're going to circle back to chapter 3. I think last time you ended right around actually probably maybe a little bit further than verse 5, around verse 8. But we'll kind of circle back and talk about this again. So, but again, what is for those who have been with us, for those who are coming in this week, what is the major theme that Paul is talking about in this section? It's this whole idea of we are justified by faith, not by works. Why is this so important? Well, because the Judaizers come in and say, you need to do this or do that to be justified. We talked about what does justified mean? It means being put into right relationship with God, right? They're saying you need to do the Mosaic law, the Jewish law, and then you'll be justified. And Paul was saying, no, right? We believe as Christians that it's faith. We talked about what faith was a couple of weeks ago. This act of faith, this act of entrusting ourselves completely to God, that's what justifies us. That puts us into right relationship with God. And then we do certain things that express that, right? There's works that express our life of faith. But he's trying to reiterate again and again that it's through faith, not through works. And so the reason he's saying, oh, stupid Galatians, is because they're not getting that, even though that was what Paul had preached to them originally. So in chapter 3, there's actually 3 arguments that Paul uses to support his claim. So he's using 3 different arguments to say justification, being put in right relationship with God, is by faith, not by works. You would have talked about the first one, which is in verses 1 through 5, basically. This first argument he uses. Oh yeah. Yeah, we're sending around a contact sheet because in the event that in the future, as we were just talking about, there could be inclement weather. And so just to let everybody know, it's not happening, especially people who have come. And we'll pass it around next week too, because I know we have some more folks who are out for Thanksgiving. So obviously the people that are on live stream don't have to worry about that because they can just tune in no matter what. But so the first argument he uses is, we talked about this, or this would have been talked about last week, right? Verses 1 through 5 here. Is just an argument from experience, from their own Christian experience, right? He's talking about how you as Christians, how were you saved? What happened that made you in this right relationship with God? It was through faith in the death and resurrection of Christ. It wasn't through, Paul telling you, okay, now you have to do this. You have to follow this or that, prescription of the Jewish law. No, it was through a relationship of faith. So that's that first argument. The second one, which is I think where you ended up last week, this is starting at verse 6 and continuing on, is he gives the example of who's the person he talked about from the Old Testament, who's this great example of justification by faith. Abraham. And do you remember why was the example of Abraham so important? Like, again, what is he trying to prove? Is the second argument with him trying to prove that justification, we come into right relationship with God through faith rather than works. Why is Abraham, as he talks about here, as we'll talk about today, do you remember why that was such an important example? Yes.
Because he didn't do the works. It was before his time.
Yes, exactly. So Abraham comes about centuries before the law, the Mosaic law, is given to the people of Israel. Remember, Abraham, I listened back to Deacon Larry, not because I'm trying to check up to see what he's saying, no, but just because I'm always interested to see what you talk about. But he talked about this. He said, right, we talk about ourselves as the Abrahamic religions, right? Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, because everything goes back to our father in faith, Abraham. Actually, in one of the Eucharistic prayers, we even say that Abraham, our father in faith. So he's kind of the earliest, really the earliest one in our tradition who hears God and who makes this covenant with God. Obviously, you have Adam and Eve, and then some of the descendants after that. But Abraham is the first one in a special way who received this call of the Lord and begins this covenantal relationship with God. And so Abraham, as was just mentioned, right, he comes around centuries before there's a law, there's a Jewish law, right, before Moses and all that. So what is Paul trying to say? He's basically saying, well, how did Abraham, how did he come into right relationship with God? If it's all based on doing these certain prescriptions of the law, well, Abraham didn't have the law. So how was it that he was justified, was in right relationship with God? Obviously, we know he was because he was chosen by God in a special way. And how was it? Through faith, right? That's that verse 6, which is so important. You probably heard this before. Thus, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. The translation kind of makes it difficult to understand exactly what that's saying. What is that saying? He believed God, meaning he had faith. So Abraham had faith, and it was credited to him as righteousness. What does that mean? And he was justified. He was made righteous through that. So he's basically, what is that saying? And he's quoting here, obviously, from the scriptures. So he's saying Abraham had a relationship with faith with God, and that's what justified him. He didn't have the luxury of having the Jewish law at the time or the prescriptions of the dietary restrictions or whatever. All he had was this relationship with God, and that's what rendered him justified. So we'll continue reading through here to get this example of Abraham and why it's so important. And more so than just as an argument for why justification happens through faith rather than works, it's also going to be, I think, a good reflection for us because he talks about Abraham and Abraham's life of faith, and he can kind of speak to our own life of faith too. So let's enter into this. So we just read verse 6. Again, this is the second argument saying that Abraham is this example of somebody who had faith, which is what made him righteous rather than the works of the law. Now, why don't we have somebody read, this is verses 7, and we'll do 7 through 9. Okay, somebody want to read that? Yeah, go ahead.
So you see that it is men of faith who are sons of Abraham. In the scriptures, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all nations be blessed, so that those who are men of faith are blessed with Abraham who had faith.
So it may not be very apparent to us as we're reading this many centuries later, but verse 7 would have been a really controversial, really provocative statement of Paul's. Why? This phrase here, the children of Abraham, who referred to themselves even in the New Testament as the children of Abraham, and still do today.
The Jewish people.
The Jewish people, exactly. So they refer to themselves, obviously we do too, as Christians, as Muslims do as well, right? They're Abrahamic religions. But during this time especially, the children of Abraham were the Jewish people, right? The ones who were, their father in faith originally is Abraham and all the descendants that come afterward. So they refer to themselves as to be a good child of Abraham was to be a good Jewish person, meaning somebody who's following the law of the Jews and everything. Now, what is Paul saying here? He's saying, realize, you stupid Galatians, get into your minds that it is those who have faith who are children of Abraham. So what is he saying here? He's totally broadening the category of what it means to be a true child of Abraham. He's like, it doesn't just mean following the prescriptions of the law, of the Mosaic law. It means more broadly having faith. Yes.
Well, I would bet in that argument were the people who thought they were the real followers because they had followed Abraham, and Abraham is the patriarch.
Mm-hmm.
And so now this other thing is coming up, and so there must have always been, until Paul talked about this, that sense that, the others weren't as good as those who followed.
Exactly.
Which is kind of what we have in our church too sometimes.
I was just going to say, this is where we can kind of broaden the discussion a little bit. There's always this kind of tension within any kind of religion, certainly our own religion, where, we want to create a category of we are the true believers kind of thing. And everybody else, Now, there's certain situations in which we're right to say that, right? There's certain things that, as to be a Christian, you have to believe certain things, right? You have to believe that whatever, Jesus is divine. You have to believe in other, as Catholics, we believe in certain things about, Mary and the church and all these things. But at the same time, whenever we get into that prideful kind of way of saying, oh, this is how we do it, this is us, and we don't have any kind of, we're not trying in any way to try to bring other people in or try to be open to others and try to bring them in, then we know we're in bad territory, right? Because ultimately, what is Paul saying here, right? It's those who have faith who are made members of the covenant, which is to say the covenant with God that was made through Abraham, are made members of, we would understand to be the church, right? That's how it happens. Not through, if they follow the law or not, because by their argument, then Abraham himself wouldn't actually be he wouldn't be part of the whole covenant, right? Because he didn't have the law, So I think we read that now and we just kind of read over, but this is a really provocative statement. He's basically saying, he's like, oh, you think you're the true child of Abraham? Well, it's also me and the other Galatians too, So, yeah.
Isn't this the whole Protestant thing though, with the faith? That yes, we have to have faith, and it says right there, but we also have things that we have to do. You have to go to confession. You have to do things.
Yes.
Written in the church law.
Exactly.
That we have to do, where you can't just sit in the sofa and say you're saved.
Yes.
So we keep talking faith, and I don't want us to get into this Protestant.
Exactly. And this is
not what we do. We have to.
You're exactly right about that. So this is something we talked about 2 weeks ago. What is the Catholic position on the whole idea of faith and works? Because somebody could read this, because right now, when Paul's talking, he's really having to emphasize the role of faith because they had overemphasized the role of works. Now, it's not to say that Paul said that works were entirely bad and have no place. In fact, as we're going to read today, right, he actually, you would read this maybe and think that Paul thinks the law is ridiculous and stupid and should never. No, he actually really respects the law. He himself followed the law. He was a Pharisee, right? So, and he actually said that some Jews who were coming in, if they felt that they should continue to follow the law, then they should do that. He didn't totally ban it. So Paul actually did have a great respect for works, but what is he saying here? They have to always be understood in the correct context. So the works that we do, the things that we do are important, but they're always an expression of the faith that we have. So in other words, this is what the Catholic position is, and on the whole thing with faith and works. We have a life of faith, like we have saving faith that comes to us, and that is expressed through the works that we then do because of the faith that we have. If we have this moment of faith, but then we don't express it in our works, then our faith is dead. That comes from the letter of James, right, in the scriptures, right? Faith without works, we mentioned this 2 weeks ago, faith without works is dead, What does that mean? It essentially means if you're claiming that you have this righteousness through faith that comes through your belief in God and the resurrection and the cross, oh, that's great. But if you're not expressing that daily through your actions, then do you really have that faith? So faith and works, yes, but always kept in the correct. Because then we could also get into a mindset, and this is where the Judaizers are that Paul's talking about. We could get into a mindset where we put the works first and we say, oh, as long as I'm just doing all this stuff, it doesn't really matter if I'm praying, if I'm having a relationship of faith with God, I could just basically do stuff and that's going to be fine. It's like, no, the stuff that we're doing is an expression of the faith that we first have. So we always have to remind ourselves, and this is what Paul's trying to remind them. He's trying to remind them, like, you might be doing the right things and going through the motions, but do you have the faith that comes first, right? That puts us into a right relationship with God and then is expressed through works.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but what you just brought up with the Protestantism in Catholicism, it seems today that in most churches, there's a tendency to judge a person by their works as versus their beliefs, much more tilted. And, like if you don't belong to this group and you're not, giving to that group, and you're not running around doing this, that, and the other, are you really Catholic? And sometimes I feel like that comes from the top down as well, so I guess, didn't I call that at one time modernism or something way back in the early writings of the popes, even the danger of modernism and stuff. So it's really, among people in our churches, that seems to be, I'm a good Catholic if I'm running the clothing drive.
Yes.
If I'm getting the canned goods, they may not go to confession and may not do all these other things.
Exactly.
It seems like you're pretty,
Yes, that's a great point. So, and that's kind of what I was just mentioning, this whole idea of when we say, we all fall into this, right? All the time, right? We fall into putting the works in front of the faith. It's not to say the work isn't important, but it's to say, yes, you're doing all these things, you're active in all these ways for the church or for the poor, or, charitably, or even just things you do, within the church itself, whether it's prayer or things like that. But where is your heart, right? Where is your heart at? Do you truly have a relationship of faith? Which means, we talk about what faith is, but we'll review that. Remember, we talked a couple definitions of faith. But one of the things we talked about is faith is that complete gift of self, spirit, soul, and body to God. Right? We can do a lot of things. We can be going through the motions, but we may not actually have that. And I've experienced that before. You probably have too, that there's people who maybe are doing certain things, are going through the motions, but they don't actually have a life of faith, or maybe they do, but it's kind of taken backseat, right? And that happens with me, with any Christian, right? There's certain times where we find ourselves, I'm going through the motions, but we're thinking to ourselves, am I focusing on the relational aspect of what this religion is, which is, I have an act of faith in God that has to be renewed each and every day. So that's why this letter is so important for us still today. People could say, oh, well, why is this important to us today? Well, it's because we always fall into this sometimes we fall into this thing of, okay, the works become more important. Or sometimes in other situations where it's all about just faith, and then I'm fine and I can just go sit on the sofa, and that's also incorrect, right? This letter is more, going against those who put works above faith. So that's the particular argument that he's making. But if you're somebody who, if there's somebody who's saying, oh, all you got to do is just have an act of faith and then I can sit on the sofa, then you can say, oh, well, why don't you read the letter of St. James in the scriptures, which clearly, as we just talked about, says faith without works is dead, is vain, right? Both of these two arguments work together, right? Paul's letter to Galatians and St. James, right? They're both complementary, but they're both going against different kind of misunderstandings, let's say, of this relationship between faith and works. So, but Peter's totally right to bring that out, that, yeah, we can easily read this because Paul is going so far against the Judaizers. We can easily read this and say, well, Paul's saying that works don't matter at all. And who cares about works? We can just have faith. No, that's not what he's saying. He's really focusing here on, the error, the misunderstanding of trying to put your works above your faith. So now this next verse 8, is also really provocative. Why? Because, all right, we just talked about who he's saying, okay, what does it mean to be a child of Abraham? It really means to have saving faith, which is then expressed in our works, which obviously he doesn't say here, but we obviously understand he means. Verse 8, Scripture, which saw in advance that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, foretold the good news to Abraham, saying, through you shall all the nations be blessed. I know that Deacon Larry brought this up last week because I remember hearing him say it, but why is this so provocative? He's saying, what is the good news? What is the good news? The gospel, yes. What is the gospel? It's the saving faith that comes to us through Jesus, right? So he's saying the good news of Christ, of the gospel, was already in a certain sense foretold to Abraham. That's an amazing thing, right? He lived obviously millennia before, Christ came. And yet at the same time, he's saying when God called Abraham, right, in a certain sense, he was giving him the gospel. Obviously, he didn't say to him everything about, what was going to happen in the gospel necessarily, but it's one and the same gospel, one and the same message of truth was given to Abraham, was given to Moses, was given to Paul, is given to us. That's a really powerful thing. And so he's saying essentially this gospel of faith was given to Abraham in the way that he can understand it. And then the further, what was further said to him, through you all nations will be blessed, which is to say Abraham's the father of many nations, of all of the nations that we understand to be, now part of these Abrahamic traditions, right? He's the father of all of them. And through him, through his action of faith, right? Through his act of faith, all of them shall be blessed. So not only is the act of faith so important for Abraham himself, but it's important for all the descendants that are going to come after him, including us, right? Because he's our patriarch. Yes.
This also include people that aren't of any kind of Abrahamic tradition. I'm thinking like Native Americans, Incas, people that had no exposure.
Yes. So it's a great question. So the question is essentially, how do people who never had the opportunity to have an active faith fit into this? Like, for instance, people who lived in the early Americas or sub-Saharan Africa or Pacific Islands. So the church does talk about this very clearly. In the times of the early church, people didn't know that those peoples existed. So if you read the early fathers, the people that I studied, right, when they talk about these questions, they speak as if pretty much the entire world was preached the gospel to by, the first couple centuries, like, by the 4th or 5th century, because to them, the world was just Europe, North Africa. And there were some parts of Asia where they're like, okay, maybe there's some tribes that haven't, yet accepted Christ, but they probably heard him at some time or another. They didn't realize there's all these other areas of the world that have never, So what does the church teach about these things? Well, if somebody through no fault of their own doesn't have an opportunity to come to know faith, then they can't be judged on that. If that makes sense. So if, because this applies also to people who lived before Abraham existed, right? Think about all the people who lived before Abraham, or think about all the people who, the Jewish people after Abraham who didn't have the opportunity to know Christ, right? They didn't know about the resurrection, about the crucifixion. Are they somehow going to be judged based on that? No, they simply, because of the circumstances of where they were born and where they lived, they didn't have the opportunity to come to this knowledge. So what does the church say? We are judged based on the knowledge that we are given. That's the important kind of rule to keep in mind. So if somebody lives in a place where through no fault of their own, they can't come to knowledge of God even necessarily in the way that we understand God to be revealed in the scriptures, right? You can get a sense of God through just, the nature and all those kind of things. But if somebody doesn't have the gospel preached and they don't have that knowledge, then they're not going to be judged based on that. It's not like God's going to say, oh, well, you didn't come to know, you didn't come to the truth of the Catholic faith. It's like, well, I lived in a bush in somewhere and, in like, wherever, where I never had that chance. So in these cases, how are those people judged? That's the question. Okay, are they just going to, everything's fine, they go right to heaven? No, the church understands they're judged based on, again, based on the knowledge given to them. So if somebody's not, given the knowledge even of the scriptures or of faith in Christ, then they're judged essentially based on, are they leading a righteous life, right? Do they, because we understand anybody can come to a knowledge of good and evil, even without necessarily without revelation, right? You can still come to a knowledge of this is a good action, this is a bad action. And so are they leading a righteous life? And that's on that basis is how they would be judged. And so in that sense, you could say that they are like children of Abraham in a looser sense, right? Because if you're living righteousness, even if you don't have necessarily the opportunity to learn all these things that we know, if you're living a life of righteousness, then you're being in a certain sense justified through that. That's your standard for being justified, by living a righteous life. And if you do that, then you will be, justified through God, through grace. So yes, they could be, in a looser sense, they could be considered to be children of Abraham, even though in the strict sense, what is he talking about? It's people who have been graced with the opportunity to have this message given to them, and therefore to respond in faith and say, yes, I agree with this, I believe in this. So, but that's a great question. Yeah. Yes.
I don't know if any of you read, I've had the good luck of hearing about the Cardinal Newman's pastoral homilies. And if you go into his Christmas, it's online, that's why I got it from, but through a group. He talked about, I remember one thing that just stays with me forever. It was 1890 or whatever. And he was standing in the church. By then he had gone through his conversion, was Catholic, and just standing in the church saying, our churches are empty. And he went on and on about secularism that had, by the 1800s, had completely decimated, in a sense, Christianity per se, much like in our country now.
Yeah.
The government taking over and people not going to mass anymore and everything. Because like in our times, that's what the country leaders are trying to do, to become the religion, the secular. That had happened already in the 1800s. And in relation to what you brought up, Jane, many of the people who came to this country during that time period had introductions to Christianity or to some phase of it or whatever, but had given it up. So I really think about, it's so easy to put down the early missionaries who came and they rode hundreds of miles on donkey or something, across our country during those years, what they had to do to kind of, even for people who came from Europe, try to get them back, let alone the people who had never been introduced.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. If you really want to read something very moving, Cardinal Newman's
Mhm.
pastoral, one like for the first Sunday of Advent, second, I mean, to me, they were quite
Yeah.
moving and so real.
Yeah. Because imagine how that would have been, like you're talking about, if you discover all these areas that, different continents and different islands and all these places where there's people living who have never heard. And so imagine how that would have been so, such a challenge for the church, right? For the Pope and the bishops, but also, because they're saying now we need to go and spread that message to these people, Obviously, also in many cases, it was done in a way that also involved other, elements, whether it's political, whether it's economic, and unfortunately, caused a lot of, suffering and a lot of disaster and everything. But there are great saints who are part of that movement, like the missionaries, like Saint Junipero Serra, who walked. I think he walked a lot of the way up from the Southwest now up through California, founding the missions, right? And other saints the North American martyrs, right, that were Jesuits who went to upstate New York and Canada. And so there's many saints. Obviously, there's also many sinners, we could say, or people who didn't really do it for the right reasons or had other motives, and that's unfortunate. But they're what they did really stays with us today because, they really did convert, especially, South America, Central America, all those areas. So
It's almost like we need to do it again.
and that's what the new evangelization is. People have probably heard that term, the new evangelization. What does that mean? It's just what you were talking about before, right? Why is it called new evangelization? Well, because most of the world has been evangelized, meaning, especially places like Europe and our country, certainly people have heard about Christ, but many have turned away. And so for various reasons, right? So the question now is, how do we re-evangelize again? How do we spread the gospel again to these people and make it seem what it is, which is necessary and life-changing and all these things. So we're currently in this season of the new evangelization right now. Yeah.
Just as far as the new evangelization,
Yeah.
I can remember when I was younger, the churches every 5, 8, 10 years would always have a 3-day mission.
Mm.
And it was to bring people a lot closer to God.
Mm-hmm.
And now they've pretty much gotten away from it. Occasionally you'll see a church that will do it, but for the most part they haven't.
Mm-hmm. That would be a great thing to do here. I mean, the comment was about missions, 3-day missions or whatever, if it's a 1-day mission, which is just opportunities for the community to just turn back to the spiritual elements of, prayer, fasting, confession, whatever it might be. Because that's a big element of the new evangelization, right? It's about reconnecting. It's kind of like we were just talking about with the whole faith works thing. Like a lot of times people just think about religion as just doing things, but to reconnect and realize it's also fundamentally about a relationship, a spiritual relationship, which a lot of times we miss out on when we have such a busy world with so much noise and the social media and technology, right? People are really not taking any time to just contemplate, pray, meditate, read the scriptures. And that's what missions are about. It's a time to just say, get rid of the technology, get rid of the noise, get rid of what you're doing, and just have this opportunity. Yeah. Or retreats. People, has anybody done like a retreat, spiritual retreat? Yeah. Or a silent retreat. Has anybody done a silent retreat? We used to do those in the seminary. We have to do, so priests, we have what's called a canonical retreat, meaning we're obligated to make a retreat every year. And that's why, because the church thinks it's so important, right? People say, oh, it's a law of the church. No, it's the reason that the church puts that law in place is because the church is basically saying, if you're a priest, right, this goes for anybody, but especially for a priest, if you're a priest and you're supposed to be preaching the gospel, right, and you don't have time every year where you can just get away and just focus back on the spiritual, then you're not going to be able to really give what you need to give. So the church sees how important that is, that we take at least a 5-day retreat every year, which is away from everything, preferably a silent retreat, but it doesn't have to be a silent retreat. In the seminary, we used to do the silent retreat, and it was funny because, you're with 40 or 50 other guys, and, it was a week long, and so you can't talk the whole time. So there were some who would struggle, you're walking out somewhere and they're kind of looking at you like they kind of want to talk, and you say no, and or during the meals, because it's the clinking of the spoons and everything, and they would play music in the background to make it less awkward, but you're making eye contact with people, and but it's important, right, to have how much time do we have to have silence in our days, right?
Yeah.
And it's so important. I mean, Jesus did it, right? There's, we hear in the Gospels, right? Jesus went up the mountain to be by himself to pray, sometimes through the night. He's the Son of God, right? So he's showing us that we also need to have time every day, but certainly also more structured time during our year or during a month. Some people do like a retreat day every month. They say, this is going to be a day where I just go up to Lord's in Litchfield or the Divine Mercy Shrine or wherever and just spend half a day just silence away. It's very important. Yeah.
What I don't get is so many people, I read an article that said the Archdiocese of Hartford, this goes back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, has the highest number of people leaving Catholicism than
Yeah.
any other diocese in the country. Now, in my mind, you start thinking, well, of course, we're one of the earliest ones, and a lot of the older people are going south. Now, I've been, not a lot of times, but a few times to Florida. If any of you have been to one of the southern states, the church is on fire.
Yes.
And so my question is, half the people in the South for 6 months of the year come from, let me think, Hartford
Exactly.
or here. What are we not doing that they go down south to, Florida or whatever? The churches are packed.
Yeah.
North Carolina, South Carolina, I have friends who moved down there and they say it's like the old days. You walk in, there's excitement.
Yeah.
What is missing these are the same people who are half the year in many cases live in this state. They
Yeah.
go down there and they're on fire. What is going on?
Yeah.
What aren't we doing?
Yeah.
I know there are some churches, I have to say St. Mary's in Brantford, and I don't know why, and St., what goes with it, their merged church, Teresa's,
Yeah.
packed.
Mhm.
And they have quite a few masses. I think they're a handleable merge, they're just two churches.
Yeah. 2 churches. Yeah.
And there's a real sense of parish. I went to my first retreat day there
Mhm.
recently. I was, welcomed. People came up to me and said, hey, do you want to come to this retreat? Now, who does this here in St. Mary's? No, people don't. But right away, and I said, who's giving it? That's my first question. But I mean, there are aspects that, like, I think in one way, and it's not to get into this big discussion, but having so many churches emerge,
Yeah.
that there's no sense of parish. And
Yeah,
I've
it's very-
always said that from day
yeah.
one, 2 years ago. How do you create parish when you go to any church you want? Well, I might as well go to Brantford then. If I can go to all these other places where I don't know anybody, not the priests, not the people, because everybody picked a church in New Haven based on their needs. They had opportunities to be in any of these churches. But I mean, it's really interesting to see, like, they have a 7:30, which I hate, mass. 60, 70 people are there.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's a 9 o'clock, and there are 30 people there. So, I mean, this is now. This
Yeah.
is not, so what,
Yeah.
how do we learn from each other in these cases?
That is a big challenge, and especially, like you said, having parish community life when you have so many facilities and all that. But I think, like you said, the retreat stuff, the mission stuff, things like that, not only does that get back to the spiritual, there's also a communal element too. It's bringing people together. So that's actually good. I'm going to take that, maybe especially like Advent and Lent are good times to do that. So maybe you'll see an offering for a Lenten or an Advent retreat.
Yeah, that
So,
might be good.
yeah. So just to conclude where we just read, verse 9, consequently, those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham who had faith. This is just concluding what he just said, right? This whole idea that Abraham, who comes about before the law, right? Before there's works of the law or even a possibility, how is he justified through his faith? And therefore, children of Abraham are people who have faith as he did, who are part of that covenant. Now let's get into, so this next continuing is getting a little bit more into, which is something he's going to talk about a little bit later, about the law in and of itself and what it does and what its purpose is. So does somebody want to read, let's say, verses 10 through 12? Yeah, go ahead.
For all who depend on works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not persevere in doing all the things written in the book of the law. And that no one is justified before God by the law is clear. For the one who is righteous by faith will live. But the law does not depend on faith. Rather, the one who does these things will live by them.
So this is another, like we talked about 2 weeks ago, there's some of these challenging passages where you read them and you say, wait, what is that saying? I feel like I have to read that 20 times to figure out what it means. Especially one of the themes that's difficult in here is this whole idea of those who follow the law, or those who depend on works of the law. He says here, it's important, he says depend, are under a curse, the curse of the law. Anybody have, like I last asked 2 weeks, I usually like to start by saying, anybody have just like a general idea about what that could mean? Obviously, we'll delve into that a little more. What does it mean to say that there's a curse?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about their use of definition of curse.
Anybody have a general? So what does this mean? And he actually cites, so look in verse 10, he actually cites here, cursed be everyone who does not persevere in doing all the things written in the book of the law. So what is the curse that people are under because of the law? The word curse, obviously, in translation sounds a little, we use the word curse, it sounds like something very like a witches and all that kind of stuff. It's has a little more power to it emotionally. But what he's saying essentially is, once the law is put in place, just like any law, it doesn't matter if it's the Jewish law, if it's the civil law, whatever it is, once the law is put in place, then we're obligated to follow it. And if we don't follow it, then we're under a curse, or we're under, to put it another way, a penalty, right? So when you put a law in place, then after the law is promulgated, if you don't follow it, then there's a
Bad
penalty.
things will happen.
Yeah. And so that's
What is
what,
the penalty?
so basically, if you read through the entire Old Testament, right, what is the penalty of those who don't follow the law? Death. Meaning, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to just drop dead, but spiritual death. It's the same for us. We keep talking about, like, we have laws in our church, right? That we believe the church has the power to promulgate. And if we don't follow those laws, then what is the penalty? It's actually spiritual death. So, what is, like, for instance, what are some of the laws of the church that are expressing what comes forth from the scriptures and from tradition? The one that we always come up with, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, right? Marital laws, right? We have to be married according to the laws of the church, which means if you're Catholic, you're married in the church. What happens if you don't do that? What's the penalty, the curse, you could say? You're not in, you're not in a state of grace. You're not in right relationship with the church or with God, and therefore, what's ultimately what's the penalty? Spiritual death. What are other laws of the church? About the sacraments, about basically what it means to be in a state of grace. The moral law of the church. If those aren't followed, then somebody's not in state of grace, and therefore, what's the penalty? Spiritual death. So this goes back to what does Jesus say? To the one to whom more is given, more is expected. So this is kind of where the curse comes in. If we're given the law, if we're given these things that are supposed to help us move forward in our life of faith, then we have to follow it. Right? If we don't know about the law, we're not given the law, then we don't have any obligation to follow it. But if it's given to us, right, it's promulgated for us, then we have to follow it. And if we don't follow it, then we're under a curse. So what is he saying here? All who depend on works of the law are under a curse, meaning, once the law is given to you, and then you have to, this is the way that you're supposed to follow, after it was given to Moses, given to the people. After that, they're under this kind of, this curse. It's really a challenge. And as he says, for it is written, cursed to be everyone who does not persevere in doing all the things written in the book of the law. So if you don't follow what's given in the law, then you're under a curse. So basically, Paul is introducing a theme here that he's going to talk more about later on in verse 19 and on, which is the law was given. Does anybody remember? He says this later very specifically, but we talked about it 2 weeks ago. Does anybody remember, why was the law given in the first place? If Abraham and centuries after him had no law given to them, but all of a sudden then Moses has the law given to him, does anybody remember why it was given? Disobedience because of sin, exactly, because of transgressions. So the original plan was not necessarily for God to give this, right? He wanted just to have this covenant of faith with Abraham that would continue on, which did continue on. But as we know, what happens with the people of God throughout the centuries in the Old Testament, right? They're constantly like, oh, they turn away, they sin. So because of their sinfulness, God gave a law to say, this is supposed to, just like with parents, we talk about this example, right? If you have kids and they're starting to really act up, and ideally you don't want to have all these strict rules for them, but they start to act up and you say, we need to get back in line. So here's the rules, here's the law. But then what is Paul saying here? There's a two-edged sword to this. Yes, they're given the law, it's a certain gift in a certain way, but there's also a curse that comes with it. Because then if you don't follow the law, there's penalties, right? In a way that there wouldn't have been before the law existed, if that makes sense. There wouldn't have been as clear and as enunciated, enumerated, I should say, penalties before the law existed. But once the law exists, it's very clear. You do this, and if you don't, here's a penalty, right? It's a much clearer thing. So that's what he's referring to. This comes up a lot in Paul's letter. He says the curse of the law, you're under a curse. What does it mean? Essentially, it means once the law is in place, if you don't follow it, there's a curse, there's a penalty that you have to take on, and that's the difficulty with it. Verse 11. he's continuing here. No one is justified before God by the law is clear. For the one who is righteous by faith will live. So essentially he's saying, again, he's quoting here from the scriptures, from the law itself, to try to essentially prove from the text itself what he's trying to say, which is, again, he's repeating. It's clear, again, as he's saying, that no one is justified before God simply on the basis of the following of the works of law alone. No, it's through, again, faith that's expressed through these works. And he's saying in verse 12, but the law does not depend on faith. Rather, the one who does these things will live by them. So he's saying the law in and of itself is not ordered towards, it's ordered towards simply fulfilling the commandments, fulfilling the things that are asked of you. And if you do these things, then you'll be in good relationship. And if you don't, you'll be under a curse. So he's saying faith has to precede that. There has to be, again, like we were talking about, this faith that precedes our works of the law, our following of the law. If not, then it's just a bunch of going through the motions, like we talked about before. Christ ransomed us, verse 13, from the curse of the law by becoming, this is one of the most difficult verses, by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed be everyone who hangs on a tree. Now there's a lot here. We talked about some of this 2 weeks ago. This is something we talked about that I asked 2 weeks ago and we talked about, but to reiterate it. Why does Christ die? Why is he put to death by the Roman authorities, but really because of the instigation of the Jewish authorities? Why does this happen? On what basis and what grounds?
Claimed to be the Son of God.
He claimed to be the Son of God, and that was violating what?
Well, it was blasphemy.
It was blasphemy because of the dictates of the law. Is that so? That's again, this is something we came to last time, and it was kind of like shocking. But when the Pharisees and stuff are citing from the Old Testament, as we understand it, from their scriptures, to say why Jesus is wrong, right? He can't be God. He can't be, his claims can't be true. What are they citing from? They're citing from the law. So the thing that God gave to the Jewish people to help them forward is the very same thing that condemned in quotation marks, is what they thought condemned God himself and Jesus. This is what Paul is saying here. He's saying basically Christ took upon himself the curse, the penalty of the law. What is the penalty of the law? The curse of the law? Death. So Christ, God, took upon himself death as a penalty for those who go against the law, in order to show that, to rise again, to show that death has no power, that the curse of the law has no power. It's an amazing thing, like an amazing thing. So it basically, this thing that God gave to help us, we actually misunderstood what it was for. So the people that were given this gift, they misunderstood what it was for. They ended up trying to make it argue that God himself was at fault, right? That Jesus was not God. And therefore, God took the penalty. God could have said, oh, you're wrong. I'm going to smite you. I'm going to destroy you because you're misunderstanding this gift. What did he actually do? No, he did the opposite. He took on the penalty of the law, which is death, and then he conquered it. Huge things that we're talking about here. And your mind should be turning around in circles. Mine is every time I talk about it, because you're thinking, how does this make any sense? Right? But this verse right here sums it up. This is really the heart of what we Christians believe about redemption, about why did Christ have to die, right? That's a big question. Why does Christ have to die on the cross? Because of this, right? What Paul's talking about here. Right? He takes on the penalty that we should pay because we can't, follow all these things as we should. He dies, he takes on that penalty, but then he conquers all that. He rises to show us that if we have faith in him, again, this is where faith comes in. If we have faith in him, then we too do not need to suffer the penalty of the law, or basically of death, right? Because we can rise again.
So the living law was put to death over the written law.
Yeah. But it also shows you what happens when human beings like us, which happens all the time, we misunderstand what God gives us, right? They were given a gift that was meant to prepare them to accept the Messiah when he did come.
The ugly gift.
And they used that very gift to deny the presence of the Messiah when he did come. And some of the things that they cited sound very, like basically, essentially, like was just mentioned before, right? That what is the law condemn? It condemns blasphemy. It condemns those who claim that they're God. All these kind of things. So yeah, there's a certain degree to which they're right in claiming these things, but they're not getting the full picture. They're not realizing that the whole law and the prophets was given. Why? To lead us to accept the Messiah when he did come. And so for other reasons, they ended up using, again, yeah, like you just said, the written law to put to death the living law. And the other amazing part about this is, again, like I just mentioned before, God, Jesus, did not in any way need to suffer that. When people were misunderstanding the written law and wanting to put the living law, Christ, to death, God's all powerful. He could have simply just said, "See you later." He could have whatever, and he doesn't. Right? He suffers the death on the cross to show us again our own sinfulness, but also to show us that he's like us in all things except sin, right? He's gonna accept all of everything that what it means to be a human person currently, including death, including suffering, all these things, to show us that he's that close to us, and then he's going to rise to give us new life.
Aren't they jealous of him too? I mean, he went around saying he shouldn't do this. Not finally, but you shouldn't be doing this with the money changers. You should be willing to suffer. Nobody likes that kind of thing.
Yes.
So, it's like one of those age-old things, if people don't do things the way our expectations are,
yes,
we immediately kind of.
And that's exactly, you hit the nail on the head. What is it? Because people say, why did these people not accept Jesus when he came? He seemed to be claiming that he was the Messiah. And one of the major reasons was because if you look back into the Old Testament, what we as Christians refer to as the Old Testament, right? The Jewish scriptures. If you look in the prophets, when they're making these prophecies that we're going to read in Advent, all the prophecies, Ezekiel and Isaiah, they're talking about the coming of the Messiah. And the people of the time focus more so on many of the prophecies which present the Messiah as a triumphant political figure, basically a king, who would come back and would basically conquer all of the land of Israel and get rid of all of the other nations and would establish the Davidic kingdom again. So it was this conquering kind of like political ruler figure. Then this guy comes along, Jesus Christ, who, turned the other cheek, right, is totally not, he doesn't, what does he say? Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's. He doesn't really have a big, a lot of his concentration isn't on political authorities and rulers. It's on, healings, miracles. It's on the poor. It's on the marginalized communities, right? It's not what they expected. Now, Jesus obviously was claiming to be also, if you look at the end of the book of the prophet Isaiah, right, there's this passage in which Isaiah continues to refer to the suffering servant. You might have heard of the suffering servant in Isaiah. What is the suffering servant? Isaiah is essentially, prophesying basically that the Messiah would also come as a suffering servant, meaning somebody who, and this is all these famous passages that we read during Lent, somebody who, bears buffeting and spitting and somebody who is totally, suffers terribly, right? So this idea of also the Messiah as this, not this great worldly political figure, but also this person who suffers and does turn the other cheek. Now, the people during the time, they didn't want to associate that with the Messiah. They said, no, we're just going to associate these prophecies with the Messiah, right? And not this other one. And now in the light of, all these centuries, we realize, oh, Christ was also coming to fulfill those prophecies too of the suffering servant. And he was also coming to fulfill, in a certain sense, the political prophecies as well, but just not in the way they expected, right? Because yes, the Davidic kingdom is restored. Yes, we do have Christ the King. Yes, his dominion has to spread through all the world, but not as a political reality through the church, right? And they weren't seeing that, right? They were not so it was kind of a selective reading of the prophecies rather than a fuller, kind of more holistic reading. So great stuff we're talking about. We have a couple minutes left. So again, these verses are really jam-packed with stuff. And again, you should read this. Every time I read it and I think, wow, what is going on here? But essentially, what is he saying? That, and this goes back to ourselves, sinful human beings, right? These people that were given this great gift, which again, it is a gift of the law because of their transgressions, right? They're sinful, they're causing transgressions. So God says, let me give you this thing called the law to help you get back into line. And so they say, okay, they take it, but then they use that very thing that was given to them to go against God when his son comes in their midst, right? And to put him to death, God to death, right? And God accepts that, the penalty of the curse of the law, in order to give us new life through faith. So we're just going to finish up with verse 14. We'll read again 13 and 14. Christ ransomed us again from the curse of the law, again, which is the penalty of the law, which is spiritual death, by becoming a curse for us, which is to say, by taking on the penalty of death for us. For it is written, cursed be everyone who hangs on a tree. That the blessing of Abraham, so he does this, that the blessing of Abraham might be extended to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So why is it that Jesus takes upon himself the penalty of the law, which is death? Why does he have to do that? So that the blessing of Abraham, again, this, which is righteousness through faith, could be given, the possibility that could be given to all peoples, not just the Jewish people, the Gentiles too, the nations, through Christ Jesus, so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Again, he concludes with faith. So this goes to the heart of what it means for us to be a Christian, right? Which is to say, we believe through faith, obviously, that Jesus died and rose again, and that if we unite ourselves with that sacrifice and that rising again, then we too can have life over death, over the curses of the law, over whatever. We can have life through him. And then that new life that we have is expressed through the things that we do, our works. But the first thing, the primary thing, is our faith in that having happened. And then once we do that, it's only natural that it's going to be expressed in everything that we do. Any last, we're just right up at the end here, but any last, this is a really, so basically the next time we're going to get to the third argument. So we talked about two arguments he used, the first one in verses 1 through 5, the second one in verses 6 through 14, and the third one starting in verse 15. These three arguments he's using to basically say the stupid Galatians, right, that justification happens, our right relationship with God happens through our faith primarily first, and not through our works, right? And that our works are reflections of the faith that we have. So the third argument he's going to get into in verse 15. So, but just as we prepare for Thanksgiving, right, tomorrow, maybe a spiritual reflection for us as we prepare for that is a spirit of true thanksgiving, obviously for the many gifts and blessings we have, but particularly for the blessing of this, right? That we have come to, as we talked about, like many people aren't given the gift of knowing about this, being revealed all these wonderful things about Christ and about the life of faith. And we've been given that in a special way. And so again, what is the response to a gift? That we have to, we receive a gift and we don't just say, all right, see you later, whatever, to one who's given much is expected, right? So we have to, and that's what you're doing here by coming to this Bible study, by trying to reflect more and more on the gift that's been given and trying to, in a sense, give back to God what he has given to us. And also, this could go for another reflection, for all the gifts that we have received. We talked about how the people that were there when Jesus came, right? They had a great gift, which was the law, but they misunderstood what the gift was all about. So how often does that happen to us, right? We receive gifts from God, whatever they might be, and we have a certain expectation about how it's supposed to be used. And we're like, oh, this is how it has to be used because that's what I want. And then we might get into a trap, right? Where we miss the Messiah in our midst, right? So what are the gifts that are given to us? Why has God given them to us? And maybe sometimes we have to let go of our own expectations and desires to see how he wants that to be given, how he wants that to be used in our life. Otherwise, we run the risk of the Galatians, right? Or the Pharisees who didn't accept Jesus, right? So good reflection for Thanksgiving, I think. And next week we will continue. So we'll continue with verse 15. So we'll conclude in prayer and also give a blessing as well for Thanksgiving. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we are so thankful as we come before you this afternoon once more, giving thanks for all of the many blessings that we have received. Family, friends, loved ones who care for us. The gift of the community of faith that we share in here in New Haven, this parish community. The gift of those in our parish who have helped us on the road to faith. But most importantly, we give thanks for the greatest gift of all, which is that new life, that divine life that comes to us through our faith in you and in your Son, Jesus, and what he has done for us, his death and resurrection. This is the greatest gift that we have all received. And we ask, Lord, for the blessing to continue to receive that gift day in and day out, but also to use that gift in the way that we are called to use it, which is to say, to follow our vocation in life, to use that divine life that's given to us, to allow it to grow and to foster, not to allow it to be dried up and useless, but allow it to be used for your kingdom and for your glory. So we pray for your grace and your blessing upon us. And also we pray, and as we approach Thanksgiving, your blessing upon our nation, upon all the people of our nation, upon all of our families and friends, especially those who are coming to gather with us, for safe travel and safe passage, and for blessings on all the celebration and the camaraderie and the conversation that we will have tomorrow, that your will might always be done, that you might always bless us with this and every blessing. And Lord, I ask your blessing upon all who are present, those who are present here with us, those who are watching us on the live stream, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Enjoy, and we'll see you in the future. So
Who's cooking at your house?
I am blessed because I have, so I'm going up to my parents' home in Newington, which is